that you accept that, and we will get going.
Okay, so I'm Andrea Popa. I am the chair of GRAC, the Government Regulations Advisory Committee that hosts the Spring Immigration Workshop. And it is really my pleasure to be presenting or moderating on this topic today. Just a couple of Zoom tips before we get into the content. There's a lot of people in the room today, so we do want to be able to see who's here and who's joining us for this conversation. Please feel free to change your name so that we can see both who you are and where you're from, pronouns if you prefer. You are welcome to turn on your video if you like, because it's such a big room. You're also welcome to keep your video off for the first part, and make certain that you're muting yourself while you're here. Feel free to connect with colleagues through chat. So the chat function will be live throughout. You're also welcome to ask questions in the chat. And Shannon Gerber will be sort of reviewing the questions, and we will have a time for questions later on in the presentation. Before we start the topic today, I do just want to acknowledge the moment that we're in. I think it's sobering to consider how timely this topic is this week, especially as we consider the violence that's happened in Atlanta this week. Unfortunately, this isn't an isolated incident. And so while we're very much aware that this information is timely right now, we also feel like it's important all the time, and that international students negotiate race conversations and dialogue throughout their experience here in the US. And that sometimes there's not really a place for international students in the conversation. Perhaps folks don't understand or don't give international students a place at the table to engage in dialogue, etc. I know I can speak from my own experience as an international student advisor with a few years experience. A lot of the people that are my colleagues, and that's many of you in the room, are very commonly white, female, middle to upper class. Perhaps our first exposure to intercultural experiences was through college and study abroad. So we're coming from perhaps a more affluent sort of point of view. As designated school officials legally, where we have citizenship status or lawful permanent residence. So we're talking from a place, even though we represent international students and we work with international students, so much of what we do is compliance and paperwork. And so it's important for us to realize that the lived experience of international students here in the US is so much more than the paperwork and compliance. Conversations about race and how international students fit into the US context are very important for the experience that they end up having in our colleges and universities. So because this is such an important conversation and such an important topic to me, and also because I don't feel like an expert, I am really pleased to be able to invite a few other folks into the room that do have academic experience, research experience in looking into how international students can be better positioned and better represented in these conversations. Throughout the presentation today, we will be inserting international student quotes. So these are quotes from real international students that relate to how they see themselves with regard to US race and identity conversations. So I'm going to start out with this one, which I think frames the conversation quite nicely. So this student says, "I feel like I'm temporary. When you look at my passport, it says alien. So I don't really feel like without staying here, I could really say I belong. What I have to say would actually be taking the space of an American minority. Who could tell their story and their actual struggle in America? At most, all I can do is support them and help them get more support, but that's it." So in this session, we're going to consider the racialization of international students and how they're perceived in the US context. We're going to discuss US history and the legacy of racism that's presented to international students. And we're going to share best practices for engaging international students in dialogue about race, ethnicity, and identity. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues and let them introduce themselves first. And so Nia, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm got an echo. I hope you don't hear the echo too. I'm Nia DeYoung. I'm director of the Center for International Students and Scholars at Bentley University, and so glad to be part of this panel today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Crystal George Mwangi. I'm an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I study higher education, and this year I also have a joint appointment with the International Programs Office at UMass, where I'm helping them engage around diversity, equity, and inclusion in their work and help shape strategic efforts towards globally engaged research at the university.
Hi, everyone. Christina Yao. I'm an assistant professor and program coordinator of the Higher Education and Student Affairs Master's Program at the University of Chicago, and it is lovely to be here with everybody.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the content of the presentation for today. And again, thanks everyone for joining and being with us. And we wanted to start by sharing a bit about the US historical context of racism that continues to impact society today, as well as where international students enter into that context in contemporary times. And listening to what I'm about to share, I think it's important to consider how connecting the past to the present might be used as a tool to engage international students in conversations about race and racism. Many are from countries where things like maybe colonization or other things that have quote unquote happened in the past continue to presently impact their society. And the US is no different around having things that connect past to present. So this might be an entry point of conversation and discussing that issue with students. But race and racism, again, were predominant tools used in the construction of US society. And this was done originally in two ways, right? Via settler colonialism, in which indigenous peoples and cultures had attempts on eradication through various forms of displacement, religious convergence, and genocide. And then via transatlantic slavery, where Africans were brought as enslaved, classified as chattel rather than wholly human. And this, history really solidified race as a characteristic that was used to create and continues to perpetuate societal stratification via systemic racism. Thus, in the US, one's race could be considered what's called a master status. And you see a little bit about what that is on the screen. But again, it's an identity characteristic that's always salient because it determines one's social position as well as rewards and resources in society. Although race might not be a master status for international students in their home country, there are likely identities that hold, a master status, whether it might be social class or gender. And so again, even the concept of master status is another potential point of conversation to discuss with students, to ask them, what are the really salient social identities, and talking about why race is one in the US. And again, kind of starting dialogue there. But regardless of what master status a person identifies with, it's oftentimes largely due to interactions with the external environment. And that environment then shapes how we see and understand ourselves and our relationships with others. In some instances, a person's master status can change over the course of their life. However, a racial master status in the US, really is nearly unchangeable for individuals in their lifetime. This is again because of our history, which led to the development of a racial hierarchy, with those considered white at the top and all other populations considered of color beneath. Now, who was considered white and of color has evolved in certain ways over time, but the idea of stratification in the US due to race has not. So whether via laws at one point or societal norms, race is a status determining trait in the US, and racism in the US in contemporary times reflects historical racial stratification, which emphasized a Black-white binary. Yet it is this racial stratification that has and continues to be complicated over time by migration and mobility, such as the presence of international students. So you'll see in the next slide on a quote, and I'll wait for that one. Oh, there you go, you got it, thank you. By a Trinidadian international student. And again, these quotes that you'll see today are from research projects and studies from Christina and I. But this quote, says, I know I'm a Black man, again, the students from Trinidad, but that means something different in the States. And as I was getting ready to come to the US for college, I had multiple family members tell me to make sure people, Americans, know that I'm from Trinidad, because African-American men are often mistreated in the US. And so it's important to try to distinguish myself in whatever way I can. So this was an international student who knew race exists, knew racism existed, knew how Black people in the US were treated, but again felt that there could be some protection in his international student status, in his Trinidadianness. But again, in the US, that's not as possible because Blackness is considered a master status, and it's a complex issue. So it's something we'll continue to kind of explore. But I think what Christina will present next also is another important piece of the puzzle, which is Asians in the US who also kind of disrupt this Black-white racial binary. So Christina?
Thank you. Yeah, so we can't talk about race and racism during this tumultuous year without connecting to Asian history in the United States, especially after the shootings in Atlanta from a couple of days ago, which was traumatic and horrifying. And I know for a lot of us who are Asian identified, it's been a lot of emotions, a lot to kind of manage, right? From both contemporary perspectives and then also from historical perspectives. When we think about Asian history in the United States, it really began with the arrival of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, primarily for labor reasons, settling on the West Coast. And so what happened with their arrival is that there was significant racism and hostility, predominantly from white Americans at that time, due to perceived employment competition, and the US government also explicitly discriminated against Asian people and their policies and practices in early history. So ultimately, Asian people in the United States often represent the yellow peril, which refers to fear and distrust of Asian individuals that categorizes Asians as forever foreigners. And as forever foreigners, Asian people are often considered the other, as positioned against white Americans. And since the early 19th century, Asians have been identified as being unable to assimilate and cause competition, disease, and immorality, with the disease aspect evident during the SARS outbreak in 2003, obviously within the COVID pandemic that we're currently experiencing this. And then also the immorality piece, we also see that in the Atlanta shooting, in which the shooter has blamed workers for allegedly being sexualized beings that tempt him. And so a lot of things that are happening currently within this past year, even up to right now, right, a couple of days ago and everything, are very much rooted in the idea of the yellow peril and the fear and the distrust of Asian individuals. So on the next slide, I have a quotation that is from a study from a focus group that was conducted this past summer. And these happen to be Asian international graduate students who was talking about this. And that, as we talked about with the current events in COVID-19, Asians in the United States are often marked with being bearers of disease within this racialized global crisis. But so troubling about this, there's a lot of things troubling about this quotation, but I want to point out that there's multiple layers to this experience, right? So students are just shopping in Target and saying, we're just trying to buy whatever we're trying to buy. Somebody comes up, says some discriminatory remarks to them. And then what's really troubling to me is that they wanted to report it, but they stopped because they said, no one's going to believe you, right? That it was so unbelievable that somebody would come discriminated against you. Don't even bother reporting it and everything. And that's a whole other issue too, is that, stating random people attack Asian students knowing that we would not take revenge. And we've seen that also throughout other things that have happened on our campuses, including most recently, there's been a lot of reports about international students, especially international graduate students, who have had a lot of issues with their supervisors, their chairs, everything like that. And a lot of it has been rooted in some of the way that our students are positioned within the hierarchy in the United States. So on the next slide, okay, racist nativism. So racist nativism. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to just talk to you a little bit about some of the constructs, the concepts, the foundational pieces that kind of guide a lot of the work that Crystal and I actually do with our research. And when we talk about why are students racialized and how are they racialized, right? So giving some of the context with that. But racist nativism is really rooted in LACCRIT, or Latino critical theory, which is an offshoot of critical race theory. And so with racist nativism, people and immigrants of color are often labeled as perpetual foreigners and perceived as non-native and not belonging to the monolithic American identity. And so as a result, many individuals of color, no matter their immigration status in the United States, become and remain othered and marked as different from the white dominant US citizens. And so race and racial systems, what we know, right, is that it changes depending on with the transnational processes. So when we have students who study abroad or students coming here to study on our campuses, because we all exist within a world racial system. And so students are really affected by racist nativism because race moves under the intensification of transnational flows and connection. And that racist nativism often arises in times of scarcity and conflict, as evidenced by previous situations such as the post 9/11 immigration policies, the more recent travel bans, and the current conditions within a health pandemic that has contributed to more visible xenophobia and othering. And so the next slide, there's another student quotation from a research project from student participants who shared that they just felt US students always seem to feel superior, a lot of it because of the citizenship, and that the superiority definitely impacts a lot of our international students. This particular student talked a lot about feeling this in his classes, that when there's time for group work or there's time for collaborative learning, he's like, a lot of people don't want to be in a group with me because they think my English isn't good enough and that I'm not able to really participate and help everybody get a good grade. And so this is a lot of what he talked about. So the next slide. So in this next slide, I want to give a little context. This is actually a paper that George, that Crystal and I co-authored with another co-author. And in this paper, we argue that the experiences of international students of color can be examined using critical race theory. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with CRT has multiple tenets, including the permanence of race and racism, interest convergence, and whiteness as property. And most importantly, in this piece, we make the argument that international students become racialized beings within the US context, within the dynamics of racist nativism that crosses both real and imagined borders. And using a critical theory, we argue that international students are not neutral beings, nor do they have that one identity, that it's really an intersection of multiple identities, including race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, and language, as a way that we have to move away from a values neutral essentializing of this population, which is how we've typically been approaching international research and practice. So the next slide is another quotation. It's after a campus incident in which a self-proclaimed white supremacist student espoused a lot of violence, a lot of racist rhetoric in a YouTube video that got leaked to the entire campus. And as you can imagine, everybody was very panicked and everybody was like, how could this happen on our campus? And what we know happens all the time on our campuses and everything. This particular quotation is from a student from Rwanda who talked a lot in our first interview about how his mother didn't even want him to come to the United States. And when I asked a little bit about the follow-up, he's like, oh, she thinks I'm going to end up with a bullet in my head because, you know, Black men get shot here by the police all the time. So she thinks it's a really unsafe place for me. And so especially after this incident, his mother was very terrified, very concerned. Especially for him, having been raised in Rwanda after the genocide, you know, he thought that things would be different in the United States. He was like, oh, I just thought the United States was going to be very different and that race wouldn't be an issue. But now apparently it is a big issue. And it was something that was very unexpected.
So it's important to note that, you know, there's a really rich body, it's not huge, but it's growing, it's there, of literature that discusses international students in the US within the context of race and racism. And we'll be providing and actually asking you to additionally share resources to develop a comprehensive list to share with you all after the presentation. But we wanted to share some kinds of key themes from some of this literature. And again, maybe thinking of these as tools, as points of discussion with international students about race and racism. So one of those is that, you know, international students do experience racial dissonance, particularly for students who come from racially homogenous countries where everyone kind of looks like them, or countries where they are of the racial majority, and then coming to the US and suddenly being a racial minority or being racially minoritized. And so, you know, the quote on the screen really reflects a student who says, it's not that I think that international students that we just don't want to get engaged, but it's because of a lack of understanding and identification with these issues around race. If your mindset has been groomed a certain way your entire life, it's hard to see the situation in the same way as someone who's been socialized in the US all of their life. And so again, there's that dissonance that can be created. On the next slide, it talks about international students experiencing racialization and racism, not just from their peers, from other students, but also faculty, campus staff, assistantship supervisors, individuals within their local or college town. I've had international students talk to me about being followed around in stores, like American students of color. And so the quote on the screen is from a graduate student who talks about how their assistantship supervisor and some faculty in their program treated him, and just saying, it's disturbing because everyone in my program has an assistantship, but when I'm talked to, I'm told that, you have an assistantship here, someone's paying for you. And I find it disturbing when some people here make it sound like they've saved you from a place and they brought you here. So again, these experiences with racialization in tandem with their nativity and nationality are definitely present for these students from multiple people. International students also experience discrimination differently by race and ethnicity. And so we definitely don't want to portray this population as homogenous. We know they come from lots of different backgrounds. And again, the quotes on the screen that you're seeing come from students of varieties of nationalities, races, and ethnicities, but all, again, connected back to race and racism. The student's quote talks about being both a Black person and then being seen as lesser. And then on top of that, an African, and I'm seen as lesser. So the intersections of their multiple identities. And then international students, it's important to recognize that they experience racialized and racist experiences in different kinds of ways. So it can be socialization, being called racial slurs. It can be a microaggression. It can be very macro, very overt. And so similar to the quote that Christina shares, the quote on the screen here is another example of a student kind of feeling like their voice isn't being present with group work, or that people are not willing to work with him. But one of the things that they say is that, they didn't tell you to go away or that we don't want you. Those kinds of remarkable ways of racial things, but you can kind of guess what it is. So this student actually does mention that they didn't just think it was happening because they were an international student, but also in tandem due to their race. And then, lastly, it's important to remember that international students who experience racialization and racism, that it can have a negative impact on their college success and well-being, even though they may visibly display their reactions in different ways than American students of color. And so, we know that racial discrimination for international students is found to increase homesickness, decrease learning outcomes, self-esteem, engagement, as well as lead to greater stress, academic withdrawal, and isolation. And so this student talks about feeling depressed, not knowing who they can talk to about these issues, definitely more on edge, they say. So again, the idea of sharing some of these key themes from the literature and then eventually a resource list with you is that, again, this could be used as another point of entry of discussion. Having a common article read, not just with international students about race broadly, but also about research on international students' experiences with race and racism, and how those things happen, and how scholars have discussed this to kind of then learn about the lived experiences of the international students on your campus. And so we're going to move into a poll.
I think Ozan is going to share it. What we're looking at here is, okay, we've heard a lot of theories, and we've heard a lot of these big ideas. Let's put it in context. I'm hoping that you can answer this poll, and it is a multiple choice. You can pick more than one. Check all that apply. How have you seen this with your students? Have you seen students who identify majority in their home country, but are surprised to be considered students of color in the US race context? Have you seen international students who don't feel like their voice or experience is relevant in US race conversations? Have you seen international students who don't feel that their opinion is valued when it comes to US political conversations? Students who are made to feel like coming to the US is a step up in some way. International students who face social isolation, racial slurs, other forms of harassment, or international students who are, in fact, active, engaged in race dialogue and advocacy.
about 70% responded, so I'm going to wait maybe one more minute to allow people to vote.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing your perspectives on this poll. And it looks like the experience that the most of you have had in terms of talking to international students has been around kinds of the forms of harassment, isolation, racial slurs, but that all of these experiences are present in this audience in terms of things that international students have engaged around with you. And I'm hoping that what I'll share next can kind of help to put some of this in further context. So I'm going to share something called the Learning Race in the US Context model, emergent framework. And this model, I think, will help to kind of contextualize, like I said, some of these experiences that you might have had international students come to you about or that you've heard they've been experiencing. And so I developed this framework with colleagues back in 2014 from research on the experiences of non-white foreign-born students. And it focuses on these students' racial identity development within the United States. Our findings from that study demonstrated that the intersections of identity for these students complicate traditional models of racial identity because they come to the US with unique and distinct racial understandings that are informed by the racial constructs and experiences in their home country. Again, places where sometimes they were of the racial majority. And so again, this doesn't mean that international students come to the US not having a racial identity or not knowing what race is, but that again, the ways in which they internalize and respond to it can sometimes look different than their American-born peers. So I'm going to give a brief overview of this original model and then kind of share some updates and break it down a little bit further based on new data that I have now. So in terms of the model, it illustrates the participants' home country and US racial contexts as separate but overlapping contexts to convey the bidirectional influence of both societies on racial identity development. However, since the framework emerges from participants' engagement in the US racial context once they're here, the model really focuses on that context to present three racial experiences: unexamined US racial ethnic identity, what we call moving towards racial ethnic identity examinations in the US context, and then integrative awareness. So we'll go to the next slide. And like I said, I'll break it down a little bit further because I'm currently in the process of empirically extending, testing, and revising this framework via a mixed method study that now has just more diversity in terms of international students' races, ethnicities, nationalities, academic disciplines, time spent in the US. And while this data allows us to discuss how students' experiences are nuanced by those different factors, for sake of time today, I'm just going to kind of share the patterns that tend to hold across most groups in the study. So in the old model, again, you had these overlapping home and US contexts impacting students' experience. But interestingly, in my new data, it suggests that students' pre-US college experiences with marginalization in their country of origin can influence how they perceive race in the US upon their initial arrival. So if students have witnessed or experienced marginalization of other social identities in their home country context, whether it be religion or ethnic group or gender, it seems to often make them feel a little bit more understanding towards the strong feelings their American-born peers of color had regarding issues of race, even again, if race wasn't an extremely salient social identity in their own home country. And then while in the US, it seems like there are three factors that are consistently appearing in the data as being major aspects of the US context that influenced how students engaged or were exposed to issues of race and racism. And that's the campus climate itself. So things like cross-racial engagement amongst peers, how many or what the structural diversity looks like of students. Another being racialized issues and racist events occurring in broader US society that particularly have received national media attention. What's happened just this week, things like police brutality, Black Lives Matter, comments about shithole countries and Kung flu, being made, things like that they're seeing on the news impact. And then classroom exposure to race and racism. But I wouldn't even say just classroom exposure, but even informally, the ways in which they're educated and learn about race and racism on their campus. So on the next slide, it just provides a quote of one experience that we highlight within the framework, which is an unexamined racial ethnic identity in the US context. And this, again, doesn't mean that international students have never examined or thought about their racial ethnic identity, but often that many come never having thought about it within the US context itself. And so you have a student who said, I've chose to not pay attention to people's races because there's a lot of controversy around it. And similar to my earlier research, the majority of participants in this new wave of data came to the US with little regard for their own kind of racial identity or racism. Some described a belief that they thought they were being given an equal opportunity in their educational experiences and didn't really understand why other racially minoritized American students would think otherwise. When international students in the study felt that they were being perceived as different on their campus, they credited it to their nationality or nativity, not their race. And so because they were here for school, they were really uninterested in confronting their experiences with discrimination, either internally or externally. So like the quote, this idea that, US race doesn't affect me. But it's important to note that even as participants tried to distance themselves from racial issues, they still recognized the presence of race and racism in the US. But the main point was feeling that it wasn't that bad for them, or that racism was more individual to individual rather than structurally embedded. And some of these students still perpetuated, for example, anti-Black racist stereotypes or distanced themselves from American students of color. Moving into the next slide, though, our findings also demonstrated that many participants shifted their perspectives over time and with college experience in the US. So again, students described sometimes actively trying to resist or ignore the impact of race and racism, but in our study we found that it tended to catch up with them at some point, and that appeared to move them towards actually examining their US racial identity or how people perceived them racially in the US. Racism kind of catching up with them often stemmed from a number of what we called racial ethnic encounters or REs. And these things in the previous wave of data tended to be predominantly forms of racism. So targeted racism that they experienced, whether microaggressions or something more overt. Again, seeing things in the news that were racialized or racist in terms of incidents was another thing that we've newly seen in the data, as well as students just filling knowledge gaps on racism. So whether they were learning about the racial history of the US in the class or terminology to explain their experiences, whether it's through formal education or just on their own trying to learn more, participants would describe growing awareness through these REs and starting to see a little bit more about what all of these things were about. So on the next slide, you see a student quote talking about how when they came to college, they were more exposed to Black Lives Matter, for example, and they started to recognize that not all crimes were just crimes, that some were hate crimes, some were anti-Black racist crimes as well. And so again, that's reflected in the quote. These REs tended to lead some students from seeing racism, again, solely on the individual level, to seeing it as structural, institutionalized, embedded in opportunity structures. And the more time spent in the US seemed to result in more racial ethnic encounters taking place in their lives and more introspection about their racial positioning in US society. So on the next slide, it talks about, it shows how the REs led students to react in lots of different ways, sometimes withdrawal and isolation, but some students talked about, being racialized as motivation for academic success. That, a student would say, well, I'm being stereotyped, but I'm going to prove that stereotype wrong. At the same time, though, what we're seeing in the new wave of data is that even for those students who said that race and racism were motivations to succeed, it was still a hurdle that they had to overcome. And that hurdle could have negative impact on their academic performance, well-being, social engagement, through burnout and other things. And so you'll see on the next slide that, you know, a student says it's a lot of work to talk about racism. Sometimes she would just get mad and go home and feel bad and cry about it. So again, while we know that international students may not manifest the same reactions to racial injustice in the US as their US born peers, it doesn't mean that they're unaffected. What the study demonstrates is that although these students often find ways to cope with racism, it's tended to ultimately have a negative impact on their student satisfaction overall. And then kind of the last piece about this framework is that in our previous study, some students explained that while they developed racial awareness internally over time, only one person in our old sample discussed willingness to take any form of action to fight it externally. But like what you shared in the poll and what we're finding in this new wave of data is that there are a lot more students who are wanting to get involved in social change, racial justice work, and advocacy for international students around these issues. Whether these international students were taking action though or not tends to relate to two things in my data. One is whether they perceive they're going to remain permanently in the US. Participants who thought that they want to eventually live long-term here in the US seem to feel a stronger desire to engage in activism. And then the second piece being students feeling that they have the opportunity to engage in anti-racism and social advocacy work. So for example, being in an organization that engaged in race activism, integrating racial issues into professional interests, or being in classes that emphasize these things present direct opportunities. And then, so just two quotes to kind of reflect this piece. One is a student talking about whether they feel they have the right to talk about these things. So we also saw students being uncertain that their positionality as international gave them the right to pursue anti-racism work or could allow them to authentically engage in it. So they experienced both internal conflict about their identity and external messaging about their identity that led them to question their role as a race activist. So this student saying, I don't think I can bring something that has meaning to it. But on the other hand, like I said, things like time spent in the US and REs and all of those things did appear to contribute to greater student representation within this category. The student's quote on the screen, which is the final for this framework, really demonstrates that, they're saying, I'm not eligible to vote, so the traditional local electoral responses are not available to me. So instead, she went to vigils, she posted on Facebook, she did other things to express her voice. And I think that currently the times also demonstrate a shift. So in the earlier wave of data, it was collected between 2004 and 2009, but this data is much more current. And I think that, again, the shifts in society that we're seeing are also changing the ways in which our international students are experiencing race and racialization and racism.
And Crystal's research and Christina's brings us to contemporary United States and what does this actually look like in the present day? So as we know, this was a heavy year on many fronts, but a lot of racism, especially directed at Asian Americans. We see that there's the Black Lives Matter movement that really gained a lot of steam in a mainstream way throughout 2020 and ongoing. But this increased awareness impacts not only Americans or US born citizens, but it also impacts the international students who are here, especially when they sort of have that recognition that they're being labeled as students of color or as Black or as Asian American, and that might not be the history that they actually understand and resonate with. So we also see a real push for student demands, particularly from Black student demands, but the demands have to do with BIPOC representation. So Black, Indigenous, people of color, representation on campus of students, faculty, and staff, and what that will actually look like and how that might impact the student experience. There's an increased push for racial awareness and better training for faculty and administrators, for changes to the curriculum, to the way that things are being taught to students, and to the accountability for past actions. So if a school's had involvement perhaps with the slave trade back hundreds of years ago, how does that actually impact the way that students are receiving it and the way that it resonates with them? But what we're also seeing is that there's a lack of historical context. So Crystal spoke a lot to this in her point of there's a different history that international students have. So a lot of them may be coming into the US context without knowing that there are hundreds of years of discrimination directed at different people of color in this country. And what does that look like and how does it actually impact them? So as much as they might want to separate themselves from it or call themselves more, Trinidadian, or I'm Black, but I'm a different kind of Black, or I'm Asian, but I'm a different kind of Asian. But how does that actually play out because students are labeled when they arrive here. So I think that it's really important for students to have some additional context and understanding of the place that they're coming to, because it does have impacts on the way that they adjust, the level of culture shock they experience, and all has implications for their level of knowledge and awareness. And on the next slide, there's a quote from a student that says, "I'm taking a class in sociology about family and work. We're discussing issues in the American context related to gender, race, and class. That's why I've come to understand that race could be a big issue in America because of what I'm exposed to through class." I thought this quote was so relevant because it clearly shows how important it is for students to understand the context that they're coming into. Imagine if many of us have studied abroad, and if you don't know the history and the context and the culture and the sort of like social, racial, economic hierarchy that exists, you don't really know how people might be looking at you and understand what that relationship or what that sort of perspective means for how the way that you're perceived. This week, we've seen a lot of the racism that's being directed at Asians and Asian Americans in this country. And the numbers are insane. And these numbers, actually, some of them are taken from surveys that were done in July of 2020. So they're even higher now, but particularly the shootings in Atlanta. And today there was actually the House Democrats' first hearing on anti-Asian discrimination in 3 decades. So it was really interesting to have that information surface just today, the day of our presentation. But there's also been reportedly over 2,000 incidents against Asian Americans. 39% feel it's more common to express racist views towards Asians. 58% of adult Asians find anti-Asian racism more common during the pandemic. And 31% of Asian adults report being subjected to anti-Asian slurs or jokes. So when you think of 31% of Asians being subjected to this, many of us, because of where we work, because of the number of international students in the US, many students are coming from Asian countries. So if you think of the numbers even on your own campus, if it's 30% of students being subjected to this, that's a high number. It's a very high number. And for us to not be engaging in these kind of conversations is really, it could do a great disservice because we're not understanding where students are coming from or what they might need from us as, you know, the sort of authority people they may be looking to, or a mentor, an advisor, someone who can help them to navigate this journey of being in the United States. So I thought that was really important. And Christina's earlier points about the history of racism directed at Asian Americans, particularly in this country, is really important as part of that history that needs to be brought into the conversation. How are we introducing students to this? Not to say they will definitely experience it, but 30% is pretty high, they probably will. So how can we at least prepare them in advance? But what we're seeing overall is just there's this resurgence of racism directed at Asians, especially during the pandemic. And there was a really interesting quote. I've got 2 quotes, but the first one is from an article, but it says that I'm not surprised by the rising tide of anti-Asian racism in this country. Sickened, yes, to hear of a woman splashed with acid on her doorstep. A man and his son slashed by a knife-wielding assailant at a Sam's Club. Numerous people being called the Chinese virus or the chink virus or told to go to China, even if they're not of Chinese descent. People being spat on for being Asian, people afraid to leave their homes, not only because of the pandemic, but also out of fear of being verbally or physically assaulted or just looked at askance. Cataloging these incidents, the poet and essayist Kathy Park Hong wrote, "We don't have coronavirus, we are coronavirus." And on the next slide, there's another quote that's just very recent. It's just from today, but I felt like this one was very relevant to kind of bring together all these points about the history, but also the present day and what that looks like. So in the House Judiciary Committee that happened today, Asian American Congresswomen, there are 6 of them, and they warned that the nation had reached a crisis point amid a spike in discrimination and violence targeting the Asian community. And Representative Doris Matsui, who's a Democrat of California, was born in an internment camp for Japanese Americans. And she described how hearing politicians, including our former president, use xenophobic phrases to describe the coronavirus brought back memories of the discrimination that her parents faced from the federal government decades ago. Back then, she said many leaders advanced the myth that the Japanese community was inherently the enemy. Americans across the country believed it and acceded to institutionalized racism and acted on it. Last year, as I heard at the highest levels of government, people used racist slurs like China virus to spread xenophobia and cast blame on innocent communities. It was all too familiar. So just in that quote alone, we see the history coming up to meet our present. And for us as educators or for students not to know that this is not the first time this has happened is a disservice to all of us, right? We need to know that history is actually repeating itself. And if we know the history, then perhaps we can stop it from repeating itself. But it's definitely something that we're seeing again, and it's not only in waves. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement had to do with police brutality. The Asian discrimination and racism directed towards Asians has to do with the coronavirus specifically. But I don't think that we can separate the two because they're both things that impact students who are international students in this country, whether or not they identify with the social and cultural history of being raised and brought up in the United States. They look no different than people who we would consider, you know, Black and brown folks who are in this country today, who are here as citizens. So I thought that was important just to kind of bring together all of the points that we've discussed. And on the next slide, it's kind of a brief synopsis. Obviously, those of us in the field know that there's much more that has happened over the course of a year, but immigration in 2020 and for many years has been traumatic, and there's lots of levels of insecurity in it. This is not even to speak about DACA and the meaning and significance of other levels of immigration, but this is just specifically about mostly F1 and J1 students. But in January 2020, we saw the expansion of the Muslim ban, officially the executive order protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. In March 2020, we saw suspension of routine visa services at US embassies and consulates due to the pandemic. But even prior to that, there were certain countries where things were not always very smooth. We also saw SIW policy directives and COVID reporting template for schools, guidance that continued throughout the year for SIW about how to actually manage the temporary guidance that we were getting from the government about how to manage our international students and how to maintain their status. In April 2020, there's a proclamation that limits the entry of certain immigrants, which was revoked just last month. But there's continually different sort of either proclamations or guidance that kind of sustain this feeling of insecurity about what is your status? Is it okay for you to be here? Do you need to travel amidst all the chaos of the pandemic? Do you need to travel in order to make sure that your status is okay? Are you going to be eligible for work authorization? Can you still take classes remotely? We saw a lot of questions that were really difficult to answer, especially as DSOs. And the last point I just wanted to call out was in January 2021, this was really interesting, but you can see some racial undertones here. Actually, starting September 2020, there was a proposed rule to eliminate duration of status, which for international students is, you know, the stamp that they get that says DS, and you can stay here as long as your I-20 is valid. But what we saw was a proposed rule that would have created very racialized implications of shorter visa issuance times or shorter visa duration time for students from countries that were specifically non-white. In January 2021, there were several proclamations regarding the suspension of entry from certain countries, China, Iran, South Africa, Schengen area, UK, Ireland, and Brazil, due to the risk of COVID transmission, which, okay, that made sense. But in March, there were some special exceptions made. And it happened that those exceptions were only for people from the Schengen area, UK, and Ireland, the whitest of all those different countries from the previous proclamations, right? And there's some special exceptions made for the national interest waiver that allowed those folks to come in if they were in professions related to academics or students. So there is still, even today, there's still very racialized undertones in a lot of the immigration policy that we're seeing, that we're witnessing. So it creates continued insecurity, but definitely seems to have greater impact on people from some countries as opposed to others. So on the next slide here, we've given a lot of information, but we also know that everyone who's here today has a lot of resources also. So we wanted to make sure that you have this link, and I'll just put it in the chat now. But if you have resources that have been helpful for you that you think would be great to share, we encourage you to just pop those into the chat, because we want this to be a learning opportunity for us as well. We're presenting and have some information here, but we also know that folks do as well in the rest of the room. And now we have time for some Q&A. Andrea?
Yeah, so we wanted to take a breather and say thank you so much to Dr. George Mwangi and Dr. Yao and Tania. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your research on these topics. I know that there's been some lively conversation in chat already about some conversations, and I was wanting to actually, if you don't mind, perhaps repeating a couple of the salient points that were made there. So I know that one of the questions, we did provide in the link some detail about Crystal's study in particular. So if you're looking at specific details about the research, there is a link in chat that you'll find. One of the questions that I'm going to pull out is, did questions of potential impact on status come up in the conversation, specifically the impact of police interactions for F1 students?
Yeah.
And Andrea, sorry, can I interrupt for a second? If you
Of
could
course.
give access for folks to update the Google link, I think right now you need permission to update it, but we'll
Okay.
try to make sure that's opened up, because there's some folks who have tried to use it already.
Of course, I will.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think so. Both Christine and I have experienced that in our data, and then as some continued comments came in, I think we both further expanded upon that. But certainly in my data, participants talked about fear of what's going to happen if they end up engaging with the police. Fear, both like, okay, what if I get, am I being profiled or things like that? But then if they have a negative experience, can they complain about it? And then, there was also this fear of, if I go to a protest or a sit-in or something where there is police presence or the possibility of police presence, I'm putting my status in danger. I might be sent back home. So, for students who really wanted to get involved, there was really this catch-22 that they felt that they had, and they weren't 100% sure if even their fears were accurate fears or not. And it for the students in my study, it didn't really occur to them to ask. It just was something that made them like, okay, I'm just not going to do it. So I don't know, Christina, if you felt, if your things reflected that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar. A couple of different things are also that, in a very current research project that's going on right now, is a lot of the students said, when I asked, did you go to protests? Did you go to rallies? And because it was during the pandemic, like, no, there's no, like, I want to go, or I'm interested in it and all of that, but there's no way I'm going to go because of, honestly, they're like, because of the way the U.S. responds to health and safety and everything like that. A lot of my participants would also talk about how, especially after the riot, January 6th at the Capitol building, they were like, there's no way I would ever go to anything like that. Like, even if I'm interested in watching that, they're like, number one, this could never happen in my home country because we would be like done before it even started. And the other piece is a lot of them talked about how, there's also fear of going to protests, to rallies, to things like this, because they're like, I'm afraid I'm going to physically get harmed. Right, because for especially a lot of our participants that Crystal and I work with, they would be viewed and perceived as being students of color or people of color in the United States, and so for them, safety is number one, and that they're like, this is not a safe spot for me.
Oh, go ahead. I was just saying I saw a hand raised too, but
Yeah, go ahead. I think is there Bentley that's with a hand raised?
Hi, yes. Hi, my name is Brittany. I'm an international student advisor at Bentley. Thank you so much to everyone for all of your care and the information that you shared. I have a question mostly, I think, for Drs. Mwangi and Yao, because it's more based on your research. Curious if, thinking of like the if we think of global implications of different race relations and white supremacy and how we can end that, wondering if any students have expressed regret in learning the US context of race, and if that's changed the way they experience life, if that has come up in any of your research.
Certainly, I think that's an interesting question. Experiencing regret, I don't, in some ways, I think yes, because it's kind of like once they saw things they couldn't unsee. But I think that that's for a lot of people generally, once you become, kind of conscious of some of structural inequities, it can be hard because it's like, I feel like I have to do something. There's now this obligation to somehow, and it can be a lot, it can be heavy. But I would say in my study, when students really got to a point of saying, I recognize this is happening, they started doing certain kinds of things. So for example, some of the African and Caribbean students started really thinking about diaspora, and connecting to that and thinking about anti-Blackness as, again, a global phenomenon potentially, and wanting to kind of connect things in their home country experience to things that were going on here. And so it wasn't always negative. There were, I think, some really interesting ways in which students started to see and connect inequity happening in different areas of the world as well. So I think that there were challenges. I think one of the things, for Christina and I, is that students didn't always feel like they had a place to go and talk about it, though, or people that they felt that they could engage around with it. So they didn't have that support, and that is what also made it kind of difficult.
Yeah. Talking to my participants, I always ask them, like, no matter what the focus of the research project is, I always ask them, do you, if you could make the choice again, would you still come to the United States to study? And almost every single one of them will say yes, 100%. They're like, it's hard, and sometimes I'm lonely, or the loneliness or the isolation, the discrimination and everything. They're like, it's still worth it to get a degree from the United States. That's always the number one reason of why they're here. They're like, it's hard, it's different, it's this, but no matter what, I'm getting a degree from the US, and that's gonna be really good for me and for my career in the future when I go back home and everything. And so I think a lot of my participants would say, I didn't know some of this stuff before I came here, and I wish I knew it. And the participants who seem to have a little bit more, I would say, in Crystal's model, and I know the model is not necessarily like a linear thing, but the ones who seemed a little bit further along as far as really thinking about race and racism and their place in it, and really understanding it, usually are graduate students. The graduate students who've been around for a little bit longer, I think their experiences are different, right? Because they might have families they have to worry about. They have other priorities, and thinking about like trying to get their, especially those who are trying to get their doctorates and everything like that. But yeah, overall, there's not been any people that I talked to. There hasn't been any regrets so far.
Thank you.
I'm seeing Denisha as the next question, and then Mary.
Hi, so I asked in chat, but I realized I could raise my hand. I was curious if, things differed for students who maybe are taking courses or taking classes in big cities versus small cities, East Coast versus West Coast, and especially like, I think a distinction that sometimes we don't think about all the time is like a PWI, a predominantly white institute, like a PWI in Ohio would probably feel very different from like a PWI in Wellesley. And so I was wondering like if students had different feelings and different reactions also based off of, where they were located and kind of the feeling of those towns that they were in your research, or maybe even in your current research.
I'll say in most of my research has actually been in what I would call college towns, so smaller areas, maybe a little more rural, definitely not a big city, right? And all of them have been at PWIs. And what I found is that, one, a lot of students would arrive and they said, this is not what I thought America was going to be like. They're like, I was thinking about the big cities and blah, blah, blah. But they're like, but the nice thing about being here is I feel safer. I feel like there's less of a safety issue. And the other piece I always find interesting, and I started doing this research in 2012, and even now, even recently, when I asked students, how did you learn about what college life was going to be like in the United States? The answer I would get most commonly was High School Musical, which was fascinating to me, right? Especially because I'm like, that's a high school, that's not even college. But that they're like, I watched High School Musical and I thought that's what, school was going to be like. And it really isn't. I'm like, nope, it really, really isn't. Life is not a Disney movie where it's a musical and everything. But it's interesting also to see how media shapes kind of what people's perceptions are. And I think it's very much affected by location, the size of the institution, and then, like you said, being at a PWI and everything. So, Crystal?
Yeah, I would just add, in addition to those things, this academic discipline seems to make a difference too. In the first wave of data, we had a lot of, it was more heavily skewed towards students in STEM fields. And a lot of students were in this place of like, I'm just trying to keep my head down, do my work, and then they weren't expected to talk about these things in class or bring them up. So there's just like, they could kind of stay a little more isolated from some of it, versus students who are in the social sciences or humanities or things like that, where some of these things just tend to come up in classes more, and things of that nature, or liberal arts institutions where you might have to take more classes outside of your program of study. So academic discipline and type in that way sometimes made a difference. I also collected data from students at a historically Black college and university a while back, and did a paper on that. I'm happy to share as well those experiences. So yeah, so all of these types of things matter. But again, it's also students as they're experiencing these things and having these conversations, it's how much they feel like they can take a risk in sharing a perspective, or have someone that they can talk to that they're not going to offend immediately sometimes in what they're saying, but it's, they're wanting to learn and understand. It's a lot to navigate.
Mary, did you want to go next?
Sure, I can hop in. Hello, everyone. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. This is so exciting. A couple of years ago in graduate school, I did what I call a baby study, a small study looking at the experience of African students attaining US Black identity. And because what you're doing is so much larger and looking across different spaces is wonderful. The question that I got left with after I finished my study and listening to you as well is, what does our work actually look like? Because thinking about cultural centers, for example, that were established in the post-civil rights era on campus that are very clear about being African-American or Asian American institutes, or actions that happen on our campuses because the Black Student Association has come forward and asked for it. How do we fit international students in it? How do we do that work without encroaching on the space that needs to be left for students, for BIPOC students who are from the US? And further, another piece that always kind of sits in my mind is the dialogue within diaspora. So I always think about what happens with, I'm in a university in Boston. So for example, Vietnamese students who come from Dorchester, who are kids of immigrants, versus Vietnamese international students who come in, have very different, they can have very different ideas about who they are and where they fit. So where is our work in all that? How do we fit in that?
I can share a little bit. I never know when to like start or not start. So, I think in terms of, dialogue and conversation and all of those pieces, it is the pieces that you mentioned demonstrate a lot of complexity, right? So you have international students who are on a particular kind of visa status. You have students with multiple generations in the US on campus, but then you have students who are immigrants who are not necessarily international students. You have students who are the children of immigrants on campus. And so oftentimes we're not always talking about those students either in terms of transnational kind of identity. And I think it opens up a lot of potential points of conversation and dialogue when we acknowledge those aspects of who students are, particularly for Black students who have immigrant immigrant backgrounds or an international status, it can be, really complicated because, for example, Black children of immigrants, there's typically no, demographically, we don't even collect data to know that they exist on our campus in that way, that they have that aspect of who they are. And so, I think some work needs to be done just on, again, complicating the kinds of questions we ask students demographically, but which might not be things that you all do in your role, but can advocate for. Certainly, this notion of dialogue, I think, is important. When we talk about intergroup dialogue, where we bring different groups together, but I think about diasporic dialogues or intragroup dialogues that have, people of the same race, but who are of different generational statuses or visa statuses, kind of talking about these issues as well, whether they are all Black but of different statuses, or all Asian of different statuses. But those require really great facilitators, because a lot of heavy things can come up in those conversations as well. And so really thinking about what are the outcomes that we want our students to kind of leave with, and knowing that these kinds of conversations are not going to just be like all rainbows and butterflies by far. So really ensuring that support is created around those. And I think for international students especially, what the model that I have demonstrates, and even though right now the arrows kind of go one direction, the students really kind of flow back and forth across those different experiences, is that the way they enter, even if you don't collect data on their race per se, the way they enter and think about themselves racially can differ for every year over time that they're, in a university. And so you can present, things about race and racism at orientation, but they might not be ready to receive it then. It doesn't mean don't do it, but it might mean that you got to keep having those conversations at different points of time, for sure.
I think also, for all of you who are currently working right in international students and scholars offices, I mean, I'll put it out there. I think you're in a tenuous position, because I think a lot of students see you as you're an agent of the government, right? Like when you're talking about immigration, when you're talking about policy, you're talking about, enforcement and everything. Yet at the same time is that sometimes you're the only person that they might really know that well on campus, or they see regularly, right? And that they see you also in a different role as the support and everything. I think it's really so important that there is a lot of cross collaboration or just conversations on campus. Things like, especially, thinking about most recently, things that are happening right now on in the world, and then also on campuses. And we're talking a lot about things like racial discrimination, right? Obviously, the situation in Atlanta is, there's racial misogyny, right, is a thing. So do students, right, when we talk about like, oh, you can go to the Title IX office, what does that even mean? Right? Do international students or students who just don't know what is Title IX and what does that mean, and what am I allowed to do? And especially if my visa status could be at risk here, right? Or thinking about even with graduate students, like, okay, well, what we're socialized to think about as grad students is that, especially a doctoral student, my chair and my advisor basically dictates my whole future. So if I'm being sexually harassed, if I'm being verbally abused, if I'm being physically abused, if I'm going to pick up your dry cleaning, every single week and stuff, who can I report that to, and what can I do about that? And so I think that's where I think all these different pieces or different arms of the university have got to get a better understanding of what are some of these issues and what are some of these challenges, and really work together and think about how do we communicate this information, and how do we work together to make sure our students at least know what the resources are, not after a big issue happens, right? Because look at all the statements that our universities send out. We're standing in solidarity with Asian American people. Here are the resources on campus. If you want to learn more about Asians and Asian Americans at our university, here's the other links and stuff. Where was that, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? None of this is new, right? So a lot of our research, the discrimination that our students experience has always been around. It's just now people are paying a little bit more attention to it, right? So what are ways that we can be proactive with this?
Yeah, and I think you both hit on a couple of the questions that are coming up in chat. One of them is what is recommended or what has been done to orient students to issues of race prior to coming to the US. And the other similar one is just what are some resources for educating students on race pre-arrival and orientation. And it's tricky. I mean, you're saying that orientation may be too soon, and I know Nia is going to talk right after this about some of the institutional programming sort of aspects. So I don't want to steal her thunder, but I didn't know if any of the three of you wanted to speak on those two questions. And then I'm going to go to Jin Wang, and then I have a couple other questions in chat.
I just will say, I definitely don't mean to not do it, like do it at orientation, but just don't just do it at orientation, because it's, you know, because things shift and change over time. So I just want to make that clear too. You should, it has to happen. They have to be consistent, because all these things are in national media, everything, they're happening all the time. It's a lot, you know, so it has to continue happening. And I just saw a comment in the quote in the chat and around like, how do we become able to do this? There's certainly trainings and things like that, but I will say there are also people who are experts around this that can, I mean, again, budget allowing and things like that, that can come in and have these conversations, facilitate these groups, help train you, or have conversations. I mean, even for myself, you know, I've done diasporic kinds of dialogues with students. So don't feel like you have to do it all yourself. There are people that can also support some of this who do some of this work too.
Jingwen, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, some of my questions were already answered while my hand was raised. My question is, some of us have resources. We get to connect with faculty. We get to connect with the DEI and then program training, continuous training for students and support. But some of us may only have, say, like an hour or so with our international students at their orientation, and then you may or may not see them for the rest of their time, right? I wanted to see what kind of recommendations you will give depending on the resources that we have. Say if you only have 1 hour, what are the main points you want to hit during your presentation? And then if you have more resources, what are some of the programs you want to recommend, some of the collaborations that you recommend that we do?
Nia, do you want to share? Because I know you also have examples too. Is this a good point?
I do have some examples. I don't know, I could go to the next slide and start from there, and maybe we move
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. And then perhaps we can loop back to a couple of the other questions coming in. I do also see the question, seeing some questions about training resources, and I'm also seeing some questions about how to, a question about how to just make a safe residential space for students. So how to sort of interact with students and residents. I will, before I kick it on over to Nia, I do want to say this is something I feel in all likelihood, none of the four of us are feeling like our institutions are doing enough, and that we all think we're you know, somewhere in the spectrum of doing our best to not doing enough. But there's a lot, all these folks that are in the chat right now, this is a community effort. And so I would encourage each of you to sort of contribute to the form. What we're hoping to do with that form is distribute it to participants afterwards. So we are voices among many, but we do also hope that you'll answer the same questions for us. So I'm going to go ahead and share back to screen and get back to the presentation if I can find it. Just one quick second.
So I'll share some of the resources that we have at Bentley, or some of the things that we've been doing that are kind of working. But one of them is just in the past, what month is it? Since June 2020, really, we kind of rolled out a racial justice task force, and that is university-wide. So there's people from all areas of the university who are involved in this. And then there's different, it's like a big umbrella, and then there's different sort of groupings underneath it of what areas people are working on. But part of that came about because there was a list of demands that students brought to the administration of current students and alumni and said, this is what we want to see. We want to see greater representation. We want to see, you know, student voices being heard. We want to see changes in the classroom structure. There is now an implicit bias training that happens for anyone who's going to be on a search committee, on an interview search committee. They have to go through that implicit bias training, which is, I believe, is conducted by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. There was a racial healing challenge, which was optional, but a lot of people participated in groups just to talk about kind of their own backgrounds with, and this was largely for staff and, well, staff, faculty, and students actually, but it was for people to kind of reckon with their own understandings of like, what what have been your foundations of talking about race, like in your family, with your colleagues, inside or outside of work, but from what place do you come to the conversation on race? And then there's also, we've had this for a few years now, but it's a bias incident report. So when there are incidents of bias on campus, students can report that and it goes to a committee and we review it and see how we can talk to the student, how we can at least help them to get connected to resources to move forward in the process. But the difference is now that report is available to all of campus. So now it's not just our little committee who knows about it, but it's anyone on campus can read that and say like, oh wow, like we've had 10 incidents of bias on campus all year, and like, what does this mean? Or we've had 20, or whatever the case. There's also some staff initiatives. So there is a speaker series run partly through the Diversity of Inclusion, or the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And it's a speaker series bringing in different people of color, different like sort of activism, but helping people to better understand what that looks like and who those prominent people are. In student affairs, we've developed, because my office is in student affairs, I know at some schools it's in academic affairs, but we have a racial justice action plan for every office for every office or department in student affairs. So what that's looked like is actually some of these topics that came about from just reading, Crystal and Christina's research, like, well, what do we need to do? How can we have discussions so our staff is more well-resourced so that we're comfortable talking about this kind of stuff, as well as our students? Because if we're comfortable, then how much easier will it be for our students to come to us because they know that we can talk about race. This is a thing, so that they know how to identify microaggressions when they're happening, or at least they know that they have someone to go to figure it out. So that for us meant updating our orientation presentation to have at least a few slides talking about race and culture shock in a different way. Like we've talked about culture shock in the past, but shout out to my coworker, Brittany, who helped us to work on that orientation PowerPoint and get it to the place where it is now, where it's just an opening. And maybe we still can do more things during orientation or during later on in their college career. Flex Dialogues is also something that's happening. It's been happening, but we're continuing it. And that's something else that is facilitated conversations by staff for groups, like smaller groups of students. So maybe like 20, 25 students. But we're planning on having those sort of diaspora conversations, right? So maybe students who grew up in the States, but culturally have ties to other countries or other nationalities or ethnicities. How do we have conversations like that? So we're planning one coming up soon, which is on whiteness. So whiteness in context. What does it look like to grow up white in the United States versus someone who grew up in another country, and when they come here, they're now labeled as white, right? So what does white privilege look like in different places? The Worldview program is something that's also ongoing, but it's an international student speaker program. And that's one way that our international students have been able to feel more engaged, but it's a small program. It's only maybe max, we've had 70 students who are speakers in there. And overall, we have like 1,100 students on campus. So it's not every international student, but the fact that they can go into classrooms and talk on a range of different topics. They could talk about what marketing looks like in their home country. They could talk about what race and, what is it like to have LGBTQ plus status in another country. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to approach this. And I don't think there's one right way, but I think that just looking at what our different offices are doing is at least gives some sort of context of like, there's different ways to approach it, whether it's a conversation or a presentation or a workshop or a town hall. There's a lot of different angles to get in there. And I hope, Chingwen, that answered your question, but happy to answer more.
Yes, yeah, you answered my questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I won't go through the whole list here. At Emerson, I know a lot of what we do is really rely on these important collaborations within other offices. We realize that just like the international student experience is not isolated in their experience with race, I mean, the best service we can provide is to be doing these collaborative sort of programmings and initiatives that sort of tie into intercultural student affairs and social justice and academic affairs and other student activism that's already happening. And so I would shout out to our Office of Intercultural Student Affairs that does really lead a lot of the initiatives that we collaborate with, whether it be our justice, equity, divergent inclusion, identity training that happens for every student during orientation, collaborative respite days that happen between our spiritual life office and our counseling and psychology office, weekly tough topics and identity-based org support. Our office, we do pre-orientations. We do joint pre-orientations both with our BIPOC community, which actually happens through intercultural student affairs, as well as an international student pre-O. RA trainings, immigration advocacy, scholarships for BIPOC students that are going to be doing study abroad. And then several other key initiatives that happen on campus, including our annual Teach-In on Race through Academic Affairs that started 15 minutes ago. So they launched today at 4 o'clock. So it's I'm looking forward to participating in some of the sessions there tomorrow. But I think that the 2 points I would make is just the importance of collaboration, not reinventing the wheel, but really partnering with key offices on campus, making sure international student experiences are visible when there's other race conversations that are happening. And just that importance of creating and saving space for dialogues that include international student voices.
Sure, so I put a few things on here as well, just to kind of highlight a few pieces. So I think one that I want to just kind of talk about is staff development and IPO that's kind of happening. So right now in the office, there's a diversity, equity, and inclusion working group comprised of staff. So again, this is a committee of folks who are, part of the office who are really just trying to think of how can we more intentionally integrate these issues consistently in the office, in our work. And so, we recently had an all staff meeting focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion visioning within the office. Like, what does DEI mean in an international students and scholars, office in education abroad? How does this show up in the work that we do? And then how can we connect back to DEI on campus? Because I think David had put a comment in the chat that sometimes international offices are really seen as separate from DEI conversations. But I think that there's no greater time than now to demonstrate on your campus that it's not just, students that were born in America who are experiencing these things. We're seeing anti-Asian violence against international students, just like Asian American students. And so I think that this is the time that's ripe to be able to really advocate for some of these issues and to not have those silos. And currently the office is working on developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement specifically within the context of IPO that, again, staff can kind of keep in mind as they're developing work and thinking through. So just that intentionality that's happening internally, in addition to some of the things that are happening outwardly to campus and students.
Yeah, these are just a couple of things that are going on at the University of South Carolina. And to be honest, I can't speak about all of these. These are my colleagues who do a lot of great work. I will talk specifically about one thing on there, that's the virtual coffee hour and race in the United States, because I was the moderator for that one. And what I realized in doing that, and this goes back to something I said earlier, is that it's trying to be proactive with some of this stuff, right? So even thinking about what I realized in that session, that coffee hour, was that 1 hour just wasn't enough to address all of this. And so whether it's sending an email out to students, or if you have like a weekly or monthly newsletter or something like that, which I know is also a lot of work, but but putting things into context, right? So things like, for example, I know with some students that I've talked to who said, I don't understand Black Lives Matter. And I was like, what don't you understand? Right. And trying to delve a little bit deeper. I've had several students in these interviews who said, well, I just really think all lives matter, right? Which can be somewhat triggering and somewhat, that's a whole other identity and a whole other philosophy here in the United States, right? With people who may say all lives matter. And so being able to deconstruct, what does Black Lives Matter mean? Like why are we even talking about this? Going a little bit into the history of it, I think would be helpful, or even thinking about, how do you put some of this stuff into context? And doing that before, or doing that from a more deliberate way, in a way that actually has multiple touch points, I think would also be very important.
Yeah, breakout rooms. So we didn't, we allowed the question and answer to happen more so than the breakout rooms. Nia, I think I've got most everything that was an actual question in the Q&A. I know David did a shout out to the House committee meeting today, and how there was some good interaction with senators, calling each other out on some things that need to be said with regard to anti-Asian violence. So we'll have to check that out. Did I miss a question that folks would like to have heard or spoken to? If so, I'd say raise your hand and let's talk here. And I know that there was a conversation about how really difficult this is in larger schools where so much of what happens is immigration. We feel that, we get that. And so I do know that really is the case. But I think to the extent that we can prioritize these important conversations and make some space, whether it's a priority in initiative in your office, or whether it's something where you're just making some strides towards improving this dialogue. Even one event that didn't happen last year could be a step in the right direction. Any last words of wisdom? One last raised hand. We'll take one last question. Denisha.
This is just like, because I'm guessing that most of the people in here are for obviously like universities and stuff, but if anyone has any indication, I'm also curious in learning like how this type of thing might also affect like high schoolers who come here, or even high schoolers who stay here for college, and also like English language schools. I know most people here are probably in universities, but if anyone has an indication how like it might work in like an ELL school, like I'm very curious, because those people are learning English. So to understand all of this might be like crazier, mind-blowing than even like when you know English and you're learning it. If anyone has any indication, I'm curious.
I don't, but maybe it's Christina and I's next study. But we haven't gone there yet. But I think you raise really, really important points. And students at that age are also in different developmental stages themselves when they're in high school and things like that. So that's a whole nother piece too, as well. And there have been students that I've talked to who started in high school here and then went through to college. So certainly, and I think, and for those students, they actually were a bit further along in their understanding of race and racism in the US. They've been here for a longer period as well, but specifically focusing there, I haven't yet. Christine. Not yet, I guess.
So thank you to the three of you so much for collaborating on this. I've learned so much in this conversation over the past few weeks, and I know that I speak for the region in saying that you've helped us be better prepared to address this issue and to make space for these important conversations on our campus. So thank you. So that's a wrap. We'll be sending out, we'll be posting both the recording of this session as well as also a modified edited version of all the great resources that you guys are gonna respond to us and share out with colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.